Good afternoon, everybody. So I'll take you through a short intro to Open Identity Exchange. As Laura said, we're a members organisation. If you want to go to the next slide, Laura.
Yeah. Use
this as an introduction. And across the top, there's our strapline, really. We are a not-for-profit. We're technology agnostic. So self-sovereign is one technology for identity, which we support and have many members who advocate. We also have members who advocate different types of technology as well. One of our objectives, as I've come on to, is to make sure that all those technologies interoperate in a way that's easy for the consumer and easy for the relying party, the service provider, to consume them. So we want to enable those with IDs to take them to market, to add trust to them, so that there are millions of identities available in the ecosystem. And then we know that relying parties will buy those ecosystems, but they'll only do so if they have trust. So any identity that they're going to consume, they've got to be absolutely sure that it is the person who they claim to be, and that the identity has been proved vetted to a high degree that meets their regulatory need often. So it's all got to be secure, it's all got to be compliant with regulation. There we go. If you go to the next slide. And today we see this ecosystem of most of our members are some kind of identity service component provider. They're providing an identity proofing service, or a credential, or a self-sovereign platform, or a hub that glues identities together. And at the moment, they're selling those components directly to groups of relying parties or single relying parties. So we have a plethora of different member types. If you're not a member, then here's my pitch: do come and join us, because we're a community that's driving forward with this common goal of establishing trust in identities and making identities interoperable. Next slide, please. And this is how we see the different roles in the ecosystem and how we support them. So we have this kind of framework level where we see a national trust framework and a regional trust framework. EIDAS is an example of a trust framework. The Estonian national ID system is a trust framework. They have trust marks that communicate those out to users. So what do they look like? What do they need to do? What are the responsibilities of a trust mark within the ecosystem? How do then ID services collected together by identity providers to create IDs, self-sovereign or otherwise, that enables users to assert who they are with trust to a relying party? But how do relying parties buy those? Assuming there isn't one monopolistic ID, some kind of identity broker is needed to take the IDs of multiple identity providers to the market of relying parties, and possibly a market of identity brokers serving different relying party markets. And supporting those are trust schemes. So these are the rules that are set up for particular markets to follow that meet their different regulatory requirements. So we see these different roles in the ecosystem, and we support all of that roles with definitions of what frameworks look like. We're producing some guides around these different elements of the framework, what each role should do, how you should do ID proofing, for instance. We're helping those who are trying to be an identity provider or create identity schemes or brokerages to find their place in the market and find customers. So a big part of that is finding customers for our members and customers who want to buy either components or complete trusted digital identity solutions. To do that, we're just about to launch a set of consumer principles. So if you watch out for those next week, you'll see those coming out. And as these ecosystems unfold, so next slide, yeah, please, Laura. That stacked diagram I show there won't look the same in every country. That's a complex multi-provider market. In some countries, there might be a single ID, national ID scheme operated by the government. There might be one operated by the banks. So we see this unfolding in different mixes, and we can help different regions, different implementers to work out how they do this and interoperate then ultimately with other frameworks as we go forward. Next slide. One of the key things I wanted to include this slide from our stack is around interoperability. And from an architectural point of view, if a user starts in a relying parties app and wants to sign on with an ID, we need to tell them which IDs are on that device so they can easily select one they want, and also IDs that are available off their device. So that choice must be there for consumers. And if the user selects a self-sovereign ID or a web-based ID, the user shouldn't have to know the difference, and the user journey should be easy regardless of the type of ID. Importantly, the journey back and the data delivery back to the relying parties should also be consistent. The relying party who's running this app shouldn't have to do one implementation for self-sovereign IDA, another self-sovereign IDB, and a third for a centralized ID. All of that needs to come together in a standard architecture that aligned parties can easily consume. The next slide, please. And slide's not moved on for me. The next slide is looking at the different markets. So, how can we get these markets going? Different markets need different levels of trust. You might know this health market isn't actually on here, and that's we consider that part of government in the UK to date. But what's stopping adoption? We need critical mass of identities. We need trust around them, so they need to be regulatory compliant. We need business cases to help reliant party, and that's one of the things we're working on to explain what are the benefits of using IDs in terms of tangible business case benefits, and also what happens if it goes wrong. If an ID doesn't work, how do you repair that? How is that dealt with by a scheme that is providing IDs to you? So again, this is an area we're addressing through OX at the moment. So little overview there on OX for you. Any questions on that before we move on?
We have a question saying that would this be useful or applicable for KYC DD on investors in large investment schemes? How because not everyone would or will comply with this new paradigm?
Yeah, so I mean, from an AML point of view, AML KYC, then in Europe the law has been changed and it's flowing down into countries in terms of implementation that you can accept a digital ID that is EIDAS notified or otherwise, depending on the country implementation for KYC purposes. So that we'd see that as an absolutely prime use case for leveraging digital ID, where the regulation is already being addressed to enable that to be done. It's done slightly differently in each country. So again, we can help people understand the overarching regulation and how you might implement that in different countries.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
Yes. It's so how can I trust an ID provider if its business is on a permission blockchain? This is a big problem for me.
I mean, that comes down to the scheme that you're wrapping around them, and so all this comes down to legals, really, not technology. So you can put a contract of trust in place between you that enables you to trust them and understand their procedures and how they're storing their particular slices of trust within a blockchain. I mean, lots of people are doing it in many different ways, and this is where the technology is going to vary. It may settle so that everyone is doing it in the same way, but I think what is needed is the legals around this that say, well, yeah, I trust you, I've examined the way you do it, I understand the risks and how you're mitigating the risks and controlling them, therefore we'll put a contract of trust in place between us.
Any other questions?
Yes. Are these digital IDs unique? Is this IDs unique to a country? Will these IDs be in accordance with the government regulations?
Yeah, so first off, we don't expect users to only have one digital ID. One of our principles is choice. They could have one issued by their government, one by a private sector provider, and use those for different purposes depending on the use case. We would expect different countries again to approach this framework in different ways. So in places like Canada, you've got DIAC prescribing a national trust framework. In other countries, you've got the government very heavily prescribing an ID and a national ID scheme. One of the key things long term is that they will interoperate. And how do we make an Estonian ID be acceptable for log on for KYC purposes in France, for instance? That making that interoperability work needs this framework that I'm talking about, so that whether you're an almost government monopolistic scheme or whether you're in a marketplace of schemes, the rules that they will comply with are understood, so interoperability can be achieved.
Okay, so we have one more question. In terms of exchanging related information with third parties, are you looking at zero knowledge proof?
Again, so it depends on the use case. So some use cases are very suitable for zero knowledge proofs in terms of something along the lines of how old are you? I'm 18. Have you got a particular certificate or permission to do a particular use case? Other use cases demand knowledge behind the proof. They demand the evidence. So arguably, something like AML, people need to see the evidence behind the AML proof. So again, I think they have their place, and in the technical delivery standards, sometimes it will be zero knowledge, sometimes it will be evidence based.
Thank you very much, Nick. So we now have Ankur Banerjee, head of engineering at IDworks. He previously worked at Accenture as a lead blockchain solution architect, and is a mentor in fintech accelerators in London. So thank you very much, Ankur, for being with us.
Thank you for having me. And I wanted to run through this presentation about things to keep in mind as we as an industry work on self-sovereign ID solutions during COVID-19. There's a big sort of call to action that's happened as we all try to apply a technology solution to this problem. And undoubtedly, there's a lot of things that we can help out in doing things properly. So what I wanted to do is to run through with my experience of like taking things from an innovation lab to production scale rollouts. So if you go to next slide, just keeping in mind that while many companies are working on solutions for COVID-19 right now, next slide, keep in mind these obvious greatest hits of bad ideas, because the first is storing any kind of personally identifiable information on distributed ledgers. I do keep on seeing this crop again and again at times. This is regardless of whether you're looking at permissioned or public blockchains. And part of this includes looking at, yes, if you're keeping any linkages that use pseudonymous or anonymous IDs, as you call them, they may not necessarily be pseudonymous or anonymous. A great example of this is there have been proven cases where people have been able to reverse engineer someone's Netflix profile or what searches a specific person had done based on anonymized data. So what do you think is anonymous is not necessarily anonymous. And this also applies specifically in the self-sovereign ID space if you're looking at decentralized IDs. So when you're looking at where your DIDs in decentralized IDs are stored, keep in mind that if it is on any kind of ledger, it can be personally identifiable information. Thirdly, keep in mind SSI doesn't specifically need distributed ledgers. So I know the two quite often get combined together, and there's a reason why the term is called decentralized identity. But within decentralized identity itself, there's many ways of delivering it, some of which don't necessarily need distributed ledgers. So think about your specific use case and look at what exactly are you storing on a distributed ledger in the first place. Because in some cases, what you might have to do as an interim solution is to use centralized databases while still achieving self-sovereign ID. So keep in mind what the technical implementation of that is like. Next slide, please. But most of the action that happens within these COVID-19 use cases, or what I think in most use cases, is how the data is stored and shared. So when we think of the self-sovereign ID ecosystem, the two big standards get spoken about are decentralized IDs, verifiable presentations, and verifiable credentials. A large part of like the action or the actual knowledge that is being shifted from one place to another is going to be on verifiable credentials. Here, I have seen quite a bit of philosophical debate happening about whether it uses zero knowledge proofs or not, whether there's certain kinds of representations within verifiable credentials that are used. So if you could move on to the next slide. Keep in mind that there are already a lot of standards for electronic health records that exist. One record especially to look out for if you're building web-based applications is a standard called FHIR, pronounced as FIRE. So think of how you can adapt to the existing healthcare records, and don't try to create verifiable credentials necessarily or what fields you're storing from scratch. Lean into the existing knowledge that is already there. This is for a second reason. You might store some information in a verifiable credential in your own proprietary format. That's fine. But when you have a presentation which needs to be actually used by doctors or any medical systems they use, you might regardless need to interface with these systems, which might talk a standard like FHIR anyway. And that's where you get to standards proliferation if you try to reinvent the wheel. So if you move on to the next slide, I think this is a call to action within the industry, yes, for creating solutions that can support our frontline staff, but also to remember that there's a responsibility here to first do no harm. It's the same kind of pledge that doctors need to take, and I think it's an important one that the technology industry working on these solutions needs to take as well, because there are very severe implications to rolling out a half-baked solution, especially during these times and especially on a tight schedule. So if you can move on to the next slide, think of how you manage and generate keys. This is going to be important for a couple of reasons. So if you move on to the next slide, the first is security. Think very closely of any sort of solutions that you've been building so far, and this is just sort of like a sense check. I'm sure some of you know about this already, but this is a good point to take a sense check if you're rolling out solutions for COVID-19 to say, these software libraries that you've created, have they got vulnerabilities against them? If yes, there are scanning tools that will help you scan them out. One is called the Open Web Application Standards Project Z-Attack Proxy. That can help you test in runtime if you have vulnerabilities. Or if you're running on GitHub, GitHub can automatically scan all of your repositories for you and tell if you have any security problems. If you're hosting this in the cloud, are you generating keys using cloud-native tools? Are your keys entirely on the edge device? And if yes, how are you securing them? And think about recovery. Think about how you can do any sort of like backup. This is more from the consumer side. Think of like, how you can back up the verifiable credentials or the keys. Are you using existing things like iCloud Keychain, Google Drive? Are you doing anything like seed words? Are you doing two-factor recovery? And also think of delegated access, because especially in situations like healthcare, you need to have things like, what if somebody is not able to actually reach their phone and consent to some release of information? Or if somebody is a parent and they're managing healthcare information on behalf of someone else, or if somebody is a vulnerable or elderly person who doesn't know how to operate that technology. So think about those issues. If you could go on to the next slide. Think also of how this has happened in the past, where there have been vulnerabilities that have been detected. One key thing to look out for is a lot of self-sovereign ID solutions have some sort of app and some sort of backend. And if you're relying on the blockchain or the security mostly on the backend, bear in mind that that itself could be exploitable. So think about that security between your client application and your backend. If you move on to the next slide, another big thing that I personally know from projects working with the NHS and a lot of government agencies is there are scenarios that you need to account for in terms of failure. This is not the time to code for happy parts. So if you move on to the next slide, think about what happens to your app in case of like disconnection from the internet. Especially working with NHS and in healthcare scenarios, this is a problem that you will encounter in hospitals where you don't have good connectivity. So how does your application maintain state? What if it loses connection in the middle of doing something? Can it keep that? Can it actually recover from that gracefully? And one example that I want to highlight here is Facebook used to do something called 2G Tuesdays, where the entire Facebook campus, if the particular developers had opted in, their internet speeds would be reduced to like a 2G-like quality. And that was to teach the developers, this is how most of the rest of the world experience and browses the internet like. So there are tools that will help you simulate bad internet connectivity at them, and I'd say throw it at your self-sovereign ID solutions and see how it actually behaves, and not just in theory. If you move on to the next slide, then test your failure scenarios again. Now looking at less from a technical side, but like, sorry, if you could go back one slide, which is what happens in human error. And the one example that I want to give here is there was a nuclear sort of like missile test in Hawaii that got sent out because of bad interface. And that's a screenshot of the actual bad interface they were supposed to figure out using one of these blue links, which was the actual drill. So go to this link called baymart.com. They're a really good UX research agency that can tell you how to account for a lot of error states like this. That's it from me. That's my experience working with NHS. And this is more from, not from the rules and framework side, but how do you actually roll out solutions? And I'm happy to answer any questions.
So a bit about me quickly. I'm Director of Ecosystem for Hyperledger, which is a Linux Foundation project on enterprise-grade blockchains. I do have a PhD in user-informed design of privacy and security tools. So I used to be a nerd. These days I'm more focused on working with our members and trying to understand how can we give them the biggest value of participating in Hyperledger community. And for the past 5 or 6 years, I've been in blockchain space. I started off with Blockstream, and for the last 3.5 years, I've been in Hyperledger. Next slide, please. So let's start with what the Linux Foundation is. Linux Foundation was started 20 years ago. And if we could do the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, no, go back. I thought that I have an extra slide there. Yeah, so it was started to provide the governance infrastructure and collaboration tools for the community, be it companies or developers that want to work on frameworks, tools in different spaces. So today, the Linux Foundation has over 120 different projects in every major industry out there. We have projects like automotive grade Linux, or we have big projects like CNCF and OwnUp and so on and so forth. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And about 3 years ago, what we started was Hyperledger, or 4 years ago, right? 4 years ago now. Hyperledger was created as an open source collaborative effort to advance cross-industry blockchain technologies, and is hosted as any other Linux Foundation project by the Linux Foundation. And it is a global collaboration spanning across all possible industries and verticals. We have really wide variety of use cases. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Sorry, okay. Yeah, so Linux Foundation has been dedicated to building sustainable ecosystem around open source projects. We hope to be creating the world's largest shared technology investment in history. We'll see how it goes, but for now it seems like we are succeeding fairly well. So if you can go to the next slide. Wait, there's some kind of a glitch because you're having a different slides than the ones that I sent you. That's why I'm.
Tell me which one should I show?
Back. Way back. Back? Yeah, here, thank you. So Hyperledger has created this modular approach to hosting software projects. And think of Hyperledger as a greenhouse for developing business blockchain technologies and projects. So we say that it's a greenhouse because anybody can come with a seed of idea and plant it into the community. And if the community wants to feed it, nourish it, and help it grow into something beautiful, then it will start giving fruits, and all those fruits can be consumed by the community. But if community doesn't see a point in nourishing that plant, then it will die, and that's also okay. So if we go to the next slide, this is how the greenhouse looks today. We started, one of my favorite things to do is to show how it used to look like when I started at Hyperledger and how it looks now. I didn't do it here for the sake of time, but when I started, it was 4 projects. Now it's 14 different projects. So we grew quite significantly. And we kind of divided our greenhouse into those 4 kind of boxes. We have distributed ledgers, of which you can think of as kind of the basis on top of which you build your solutions. So you take the code base and you use that kind of base layer, which defines the governance, the programming languages, the approach to smart contracts, and the consensus mechanisms, and use that to then define your solution. But then, of course, as we go forward, we also started to need more tools, because if you want to build something, you need tools, unsurprisingly, and libraries, because we are really focused on interoperability. So when it comes to identity, if you can go to the next slide, please. When it comes to identity, there are 2 projects that I would like to talk about. One is Hyperledger Indy. Hyperledger Indy is tools, libraries, and reusable components to provide digital identities that are rooted on blockchains or other distributed ledgers, so that they are interoperable. The most important part here is that these identities are rooted on blockchain, but not stored on blockchain. We don't want to store any personally identifiable information on the blockchain itself, because obviously that's not a good idea. So if you go to the next slide, Indy is an independent identity, basically. So it is a special, it's a special purpose blockchain that is using a Byzantine consensus instead of proof of work. It's using Plenum as its consensus algorithm. It is basically trying to reduce the cost of keeping a blockchain or having an identity blockchain, because effectively identity should be free. And it does improve the Plenum consensus that they are using, improves throughputs. The latency is in tens of seconds and not in tens of seconds, which is quite important. And there is no constitution. So basically you bring your own constitution to when you want to build with Hyperledger Indy. Its biggest deployment is run by the Sovereign Foundation. Go next slide, please. Then we have Hyperledger Aries. So there's an interesting thing that happened. We were building Hyperledger Indy, or the community was building Hyperledger Indy, but all sort of people were asking, you know, there are those really interesting protocols and tools within Hyperledger Indy, but we would like to use it within Hyperledger Fabric or Corda or somewhere. How do we do it? So that's why we abstracted those layers and that layer of protocols and tools that allows you to and build it into a library that allows you to create blockchain with peer-to-peer interactions. It provides the wallet infrastructure, a blockchain client, secure messaging, and quite extensible API infrastructure. So go to the next slide. And this is kind of how the 2 projects work together, or how they split now. So blockchain for decentralized identity is Hyperledger Indy. It is used to validate verifiable credentials and looks at data written by credential issuers. It also allows you to be read by the credential holders and verifiers, right? So you have kind of the people that are allowed to write to Indy and people who are allowed to read. And Indy will keep things like issuer, distributed, decentralized identifier, credential schema, public keys, revocation registries, and presentation descriptions. On the other hand, Hyperledger Aries is the toolkit designed for creating and transmitting and storing verifiable digital credentials that is then anchored to the blockchain. It is very blockchain agnostic, so you can. There are combinations of Hyperledger Indy, also with Corda, also with Ethereum. So there are loads of kind of side projects here and there, and it provides the key management, the kind of the protocol for creating the decentralized identifiers. So Indy will issue the DIDs, but ARIS is where they are created, and also provides the messaging layer. And finally, if we go to the last slide, we have one more project which I wanted to make you aware of. It's Hyperledger Ursa. Hyperledger Ursa is our security or cryptographic library. Again, we wanted to make sure that these components are reusable across all projects, and hopefully even used by projects that are outside of our Hyperledger greenhouse. And that's where Ursa came in. And now in the ARIS and Ursa are kind of a triangle of identity, if you will, where Ursa provides the encryption algorithms, the kind of the security and privacy protection. Indy is the blockchain for decentralized identity, and ARIS is what allows you to create those identities. And with that, I guess I have like 30 seconds for questions, so I'm guessing I'll take them afterwards. But if you go to the last slide, here is my email address in case you'd like to ask me questions later on. Thank you.
And good evening to everyone. Just a little bit about me. Next slide, Laura. I'm the founder of Bertify. I also work as a subject matter expert for blockchain strategy program at Oxford. And recently, I joined the task force for standardization of COVID-19 credentials for immunization records. So I'm quite keen on contributing to this entire episode of COVID-19. I'm actually going to look at, going to describe the two use cases that we're looking at right now. It's in public sector space, public sector, and I'll even try and try and make a link to how this is relevant to the crisis that we are facing right now. Next slide, Laura. So the main use case that we are trying to address is with issuing of credentials for nurses and healthcare workers primarily, but there have been other efforts into trying to address a solution for doctors. But what we saw was that, for a nurse, normally the nurses are, a majority of them are from non-EU countries, and they, for a nurse in either Philippines or India or Nigeria, it takes almost 6 months for them to be verified, and that's an awful lot of time. And many of them are demoralized. They suffer financial loss because they have to be waiting for their verification to be done. So and much of this waiting happens because the entities are waiting to verify documents that are mostly analog, that's paper-based, which actually can be quickened if it was digitized. So that's where our application comes in. Next slide, Laura. So, as you can see, it's not just verification of academic records. You have various records that need to be obtained and verified, like DBS check, experience, or your work records, academic qualifications. And then once that is verified and you are on the NHS or NHS register, in this case, it's the Nursing and Midwifery Council, you would still need to, it's not just a one-off process, it's a continuous process. That means every year, every 3 years, you would still need to get yourself re-verified. That means you submit your work experience and other training qualifications, which randomly can be picked and verified. And again, then the council in UK does not have the tools. So what we are trying to do is get a system in place where different entities, like whether it's medical councils or any, basically the medical councils and other academic institutions can issue digital credentials, which can then be held by the nurses and care workers, and which can be verified on demand. What this also gives is certain amount of flexibility or portability, because the credentials are held by the nurses or the end users, so they can actually move between employees very easily. And you can actually see the relevance today with COVID-19. You could have got nurses moving between hospitals if you had some system like this in place. And also, you could have onboarded a majority of the nurses who had already retired, or you can actually get them much quicker. And now you can see, the medical council, or in this case, the nursing and midwifery council would have had to scramble to issue new pins. So the next slide, please. Yeah, so I just discussed a little bit about the benefits, that there are a lot of benefits in using digital credentials as compared to the process that we use currently. Anyway, I don't. Yes, thank you. So, in addition to this one use case about issuing of and verifying of credentials for nurses, what we recently did and is another use case, which was to manage credentials. Here in this case, it would be birth certificates and immunization records for children in care. And, there are at least 80,000 children in the UK who are taken into care. And some of the things that we take it for granted, like managing of the Red Book. If you're in the UK, you'll know that the Red Book is it captures all the medical information, medical history of the child, especially in terms of their weight, their height, and also their immunization history. So this needs to be kept in, is managed usually by the parent, but unfortunately for the children who are taken into care, this piece of critical information has not been maintained, because they could be a single child could move between eight different social workers, and somehow these records are being lost. And it's mainly because it is kept in a form, and it's in a shape that is that's not traceable, and that cannot be handed over fluently from one social worker to the other, and even later on, back to the council, who needs to ultimately take ownership of this of these records. So what we did is, as a proof of concept, we actually yesterday we delivered a proof of concept for a council in London, and it's done in collaboration with UCL, where we actually demonstrated how self-sovereign identity and verifiable credentials can be used in the context where these health records, especially the birth certificate and health records, can be kept and it can be portable along with the child. The child can move from one council to another, and yet it can be kept, and it can also be managed in a way that's actually beneficial to the child.
Leading MyEarthID, and then I'm also leading Government Blockchain Association in Europe, which is a non-profit organization which helps local governments with the understanding and adoption of blockchain technology. EarthID is, as we all know, right? It's a decentralized identity management platform. Can you go to the next slide, please, Laura?
Yeah.
Okay, so we are actually looking at two problem statements. The first one is basically, as per the World Bank report, there are over 1 billion people who don't have any form of identity. And then there are over 3 billion people who don't have any digital presence, right? Which is a massive problem because that means that these people are not participating in the digital ecosystem. It's a massive opportunity, but it's a massive opportunity in that sense as well, right? So this is one of the mission that EarthID is working towards, to provide a safe and secure digital identity to all human beings on the planet, so that they can access global services safely and securely. Next, please. The second problem statement or the mission that we are working on is basically making the process of identity validation safe and seamless, so that we can reduce the overall cost of identity management. The key problem here is that we can see that most of the large platforms, they get breached, and then that is where identity theft and frauds happen. And then you can see every big brand has been breached, and then they have been financially as well as reputationally impacted. The key problem statements that we look at with respect to the current platforms are basically, they are first of all centralized. They are quite costly and complicated with respect to the businesses using those solutions. They have poor customer experience. Obviously, they are not borderless. They have a specific jurisdiction. And then it's about the lack of reliability quotient. It's like always yes or no. And then lastly, they are not compliant with the data regulations like GDPR. Next, please. Some numbers on these. So you can see that the 7.9 billions were breached in 2019 itself. And then it takes 206 days to basically identify a breach. The key one that I'm quite interested in is basically, you can see there are 191 pair of usernames and passwords managed by an average consumer, which is not necessarily a good number. And then the overall cost of the fraud is around $5 trillion, right? And that is in 2019 only. And financial industry is the biggest impacted industry in the world. Next, please. So with respect to EarthID, these are the few use cases we are working on. So one is passwordless logins, because we feel that password is the weakest link in the digital economy. They are cumbersome and they are totally unnecessary. And this is where basically we can use passwordless technology to authenticate ourselves on online platforms. User onboarding, in the sense like to reduce the friction of onboarding new customers or new users on your platforms. KYC, AML, I think again it's about how do you prove the identity of individuals, and then it's about basically using pre-verified information, pre-verified identity documents to reduce the time and cost associated with the digital KYC process. Then we have digital ID. Sorry, Laura, can you please go back? No problem. Yeah. So digital ID wallet, again, it's about basically being able to store all your ID documents into one wallet so that you can carry them safely. And then it's about anonymized data. And some people call it zero knowledge proof, but it's about basically how do you prove your age or sex without divulging more information that is needed. And lastly, keyless entry, which is very interesting, because it's about how do you get access to restricted areas without using physical access cards, right? So we are looking at basically using facial recognition and using the phone itself to basically access, let's say, corporate spaces, universities, hospitals. And then given this COVID situation, it becomes more important because now people are scared with respect to touching doors and handles in public spaces. So this becomes a quite important one. And then I think all of us know, right? And the identity is a cross-cutting concern. So it has applications across all the industries. Fintech and the financial services is the biggest one. But then you can find applications across all of these. Next, please. Today, so I wanted to basically present a use case on government, how decentralized or SSIs can be used for government, right? Because obviously we have been discussing about industries, we have been discussing about health, and then, but I think government is also a potential customer who can be benefited a lot, right? And if you see that in today's world, how the citizens and the employees access the services provided by the government, they are using the username and passwords to access different services provided by the government. And also, if you look at the global governments, there are a lot of schemes or benefits that the government provide to their citizens. And then there's a massive challenge to ensure that the right people receive the benefits that they should receive, right? And there are a lot of frauds in those areas. Secondly, with respect to the physical access to government buildings or the data centers, they are still managed by the physical key cards, which again are not very safe. And then I think on the other side, the database is basically the data is managed centrally, which again is like a single point of failure. And then lastly, it's about a citizen basically manages, so they manage a lot of different identities for different services. So they suffer from fragmented IDs. Next slide, please. Okay, so so if we apply EarthID to the different government use cases, what would happen is like a citizen or an employee would be basically able to use that single identity that EarthID provides to basically access the different digital services provided by the government, and he or she would also benefit from the different schemes and the benefits that the government is trying to provide after proving their identity or proving that they are really the people who should be basically accessing those benefits. And then I think it's about how do you get physical access to restricted areas in a keyless way. So EarthID can provide that solution as well. Can you please go back? Yeah, and sorry, Laura, can you please go back?
Like, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And then basically, as you see, right, so now instead of having multiple IDs, a citizen can use a single identity to access all the services. So this basically ensures that there's a seamless experience with respect to the citizens and employees of the government, which makes it more convenient and secure for everyone. Next slide, please. Okay, that's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Or in UK, which are helping people and based on blockchain solution and safe sovereign identity, or this would be the case for the next pandemic. So you can jump in, whoever you want. Yes. Shiv, yes.
Yeah, so so a lot of discussions are happening on these use cases, right? Because obviously different governments have focus with respect to using technology to help with the current situation, and then using self-sovereign identity as some of the use cases is already on the table. This has been used in actually in Spain. One of the companies has actually deployed a solution, and then there are some discussion going in India as well. And then so EarthID has also made a proposal for similar solution in UK. So it's about basically some of the use cases are around how do you basically track people who are safe or who have been affected, or people who have been quarantined, and then also how do you basically demarcate safe areas or quarantine areas so that the government can give advice to the citizens, and then they can basically contain the spread of this pandemic disease. And this could be the current situation or the future situation. So it's about helping the government or NHS to be more prepared. So rather than having a knee-jerk reaction, they can respond to the situation in a more planned way.
All right. Someone else?
Sorry, Nick.
Oh, go on.
Sorry, Nick speaking. So I know the NHS internally is using some self-sovereign technology around staff passports. So it's was a fairly early days project in terms of verifying verifying people's credentials. It's very similar to the use case that was explored earlier on there. They are, at the moment, with the need to move, is to bring staff back in from retirement and to move staff around to new hospitals rapidly, and I think that will continue for some time in terms of moving staff around as the pandemic is managed, and as things perhaps move regionally and peak regionally going forward. So that is something they're looking to build out rapidly now if they can. I think they've got a webinar on Thursday on that topic to see how people can contribute to to that an aid to that particular use case at the moment.
Yeah, I can add to that actually. The company behind that is Evenim and True.id. If you want to check that up, that's for the doctor's passport. I was previously involved in the project as well, so it's very fascinating. Go check them out. The second place to look at is there's a working group that's set up on these credentials at covid19credentials.com. Should just take you to a Google Doc, but it's a document that has been coordinated across multiple SSI companies on what should be the use cases, rules, frameworks, tools, etc., legal that could be used for this. So if you work in this space, check out covid19credentials.com. I'm not associated with it, but I know it's happening.
Okay.
So I can add to it. There's quite a few projects actually going on. The maturity of it is various because it's. I mean, we're talking about a month, really, of world being so focused on it. There is MiPasa, which is some of the big companies like IBM, Oracle, and so on, as well as the World Health Organization. They are creating an open data hub that will use blockchain to check the veracity of data relating to coronavirus pandemic. Then there is the COVID-19 Credential Initiative from Evenim. That is basically looking at how can we provide. I mean, there are quite a few tracks of that project, but it's around obviously credentialing and how can verifiable credentials enable us to check who has been, so prove that you've been either immune or vaccinated or not in touch with anybody who could have COVID-19. So all sort of elements like that. Then we also have SafePaths, which is using distributed identifiers for, it's not really clear what they're doing. It's from MIT. It's an app that shows you what are the so where are what are the interactions between patients in this space? And I can continue. I mean, I'm not going to take on the next 20 minutes talking about it, but there's quite a few initiatives. We are trying to kind of collect all of them within Hyperledger. The most important part for people on this call probably is that there are quite a few funding opportunities. So in Canada, in Ireland, EU is also offering some funding. So if you want to learn more, just message me privately about it.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, go on.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Marta said about maturity of the tool, maturity of the entire ecosystem. I think we are still a long way off before we start building systems that are highly scalable and robust for real-time use and real applications. So yeah, a lot of things are still breaking. So I would think that this entire episode will speed up the ecosystem and how we build tools to build reliable systems, I think.
Yes, I absolutely agree, though. On the other hand, what I hope will not happen is that we will be rushing to launch certain systems without testing them well enough, because as you can obviously imagine, when things go bad in a disaster situation, it's like quadruple the disaster then. So there are initiatives like the Pan-European Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing System, which says yes to proximity tracing, but not to give up privacy. And this is supposed to be sort of standards, technologies, and services to countries and developers. But if you introduce something like that, obviously it has to be so well tested that you can kind of, put your life on it, right?
Luis.
So Ankur, someone
I'm back.
answers you.
Okay.
How about
Okay.
using the FIDO model for biometrics instead of central database?
Yeah, and I'd say the FIDO model is actually the FIDO Alliance standard. Just for context, for people who don't know about it, they have been working with a lot of these standards bodies. They've created like the WebAuthn standard for authentication from built into your browser. The model that they have suggested for biometrics is, instead of registering your biometrics at a single database, like say the Passport Authority or the Home Office in the UK or the NHS, you register and store your biometric template on your phone itself, so that when you go to log on to a service, you prove using biometrics on your device itself. This is slightly different from how Face ID or Touch ID or anything existing works right now, because with Face ID or Touch ID, you just get an answer that says yes or no, and that's it. And it's quite common, in fact, for people to register their partner's fingerprint or their partner's face print on their phone. So the way FIDO biometrics works is you would typically have a binding event where you'd ask them to register their biometrics, and perhaps say at the same time you're signing up for like a Monzo account, scanning your driver's license, taking a selfie, that becomes a point that maybe your biometric template is captured and stored on the device itself. So it's a different way of approaching the problem. FIDO biometrics, as far as I'm aware, doesn't necessarily allow the deduplication at scale, or at least I haven't seen it being used that way. But if you're at least creating an ID that is tied to, in some certain scenarios where you do need to check the biometrics of the person who's using it, that in fact actually brings an interesting point during health credentials. You might issue a health credential to someone whom you think is healthy, and then they just pass on the phone to their brother or their cousin. So you think you're receiving a valid credential, but it's actually not, because the person who is using it at runtime, as I call it, is someone else. So FIDO biometrics is fantastic as one of the ways to approach the problem, but in fact, I'm actually quite interested to see what other solutions or answers other people have.
Thank you. Filippo, do you want to take it over again?
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
Yes, so in the last segment, did you talk about Estonia and what they are doing?
Not yet.
Someone wants to talk about that, because it's really, really remarkable.
Are you
No?
referring to anything?
Yeah, but I wanted to ask, what is the specific amazing thing that they're doing? Because we could talk about different things.
And they started putting everything online, and it would be a lot easier now to put everything on the blockchain, and really quick.
Well,
okay, well, I can quickly speak to a bit of it. So if you're referring to the Digital Estonia and digital residency, is that what you're talking about?
Yes, and the fact that you can register on blockchain going through the embassy and showing that you are yourself,
sure.
etc., etc.
Yeah, so I actually have gone through this process, and I am a digital resident of Estonia. Indeed, it is extremely simple and very interesting process. One has to remember that this is not really a blockchain. What they have, it's a safeguard, build a thing for them that, I mean, could count as a blockchain or distributed ledger more than a blockchain, but it's not, the blockchain kind of as we think of it today. It has been done like 10 years ago now, so it has been a very long time. Now, what is interesting about Digital Estonia is that they are actually recording every single transaction that happens between, or exchange of data that happens between the government and citizens, and put that on a blockchain. They have a special sharding algorithm that helps you to kind of obviously not store every single transaction since for the 10 years, but you can verify actually any kind of, paying taxes, being fined or whatever else. through that. I think that more kind of even more interesting for me is what is happening in Dubai. So Dubai has decided, or the Sheikh of Dubai, Mohammed Al Rashid, decided that by 2021, everything in Dubai has to be 100% digital. And they are evaluating, so they are creating something that is called Smart Dubai, which includes smart cities, IoTs, and blockchain as well. And they're evaluating where blockchain makes sense, where it doesn't make sense. And they actually introduced Dubai Pay, which is a payment gateway that records every single transaction between the citizen and the government. And in this case, it is mostly for paying taxes, fines, and getting social benefits. And that is running on a full-blown Hyperledger Fabric network. And it has been running for, I think, 3 years now, almost 3 years. And they are now looking at other places as well. They've been thinking about doing identity and visas, but they decided that it's slightly too dangerous to issue it on a blockchain or with usage of blockchain. So they went for a slightly different approach, non-blockchain based.
At this regard, sorry to interrupt you, Philip, it would be interesting, following up what Marta said about what's happening in Dubai, where are, and this is one of the questions that we have in the list also, where are we in terms of governmental approach to the blockchain? What is the degree of positive openness from governments to self-sovereign identity? If anyone knows anything about this.
Well, I'm actually just looking at an invite that I have for tomorrow, the all-party parliamentary group on blockchain that is kind of constituted here in the UK and has regular evidence meetings. Currently, it's the 12th meeting that they're having, and they actually will be talking about COVID as well tomorrow. So I think that a lot of governments are doing a lot of things. Bank of England today in the morning had a very interesting webinar as well about creating a CD, kind of digital country or digital currency within the UK system, so central bank digital currency kind of thing. So I think the adoption is really, really happening, and governments are really looking seriously into it. They are just not looking at it from the perspective of should we accept Bitcoin payments.
And is not on the public ledger. What would happen? You know, could they delete my my personality forever? Can I be suddenly an apatride? What is the kind of security if you build something which is not on a public ledger like blockchain or the Ethereum blockchain?
I'm happy to answer, but I don't want to take the whole space, so I'm not going to let other people weigh in first.
Well, I guess it really depends what kind of elements and how you approach the publishing to the blockchain, right? So,
Martha, see, I'd love to have an answer because I'm really interested by this thing.
Again, what I'd say is, like, you know, what is actually published on the blockchain in a lot of self-sovereign ID systems. It's not really the
exactly
actual information. The actual information is probably stored on some sort of hub or agent or end user mobile device. What you're really storing is some kind of proof, perhaps say which organization originated those credentials, or perhaps you're storing some kind of revocation registry. So I think it's important to bear in mind when we talk about using blockchains for identity, that a large part of the action is really not taking place on the blockchain. It does make the management of how you distribute these public identities simpler, but it's not the only part of the answer.
Ankur, can we give sorry, Marta, to interrupt you. Can we give a deeper explanation of what's the difference between a proof of identity and identity? Because I hear a lot of questions coming up very often where there is not really a clear understanding what we in the blockchain space mean by proof.
Very simply, it refers to cryptographic ways that you can show that the attributes that you have not been tampered with, and the ways in which they are presented. And when you actually start getting down to what are the attributes you're sharing, that's where you start getting into the elements of your identity. And if I can actually throw a bit of this to Nick Mothershaw, because you'd be able to, I think, contribute a lot to this one, because one part of this is what's happening in terms of verifiable credentials and proof, and show that it's not been tampered with and it's cryptographic. The second part is attributes and how you attest and check that those attributes are correct. Will it be fair to say?
Yeah, yes, it is, and I think as you say, what's written on the blockchain is often essentially a pointer to some proof. I think it's an interesting debate. I used to have this a lot when I was experiencing with people as to is that a static proof or is it a pointer to something that's more dynamic? So it might be a pointer to a point in time attribute, which could be your passport that is verified by a particular, I'll call them an agent, to keep the vernacular neutral. It could be a pointer to a credit reference agency for some information. And I think the ability to collect those different verified claims, I'm jumping around all kinds of definitions now in terms of how you define that a claim has actually been proofed with a valid source and a trusted source. Now that's where in OAX we're looking at how is that done, what are the standards around that, and that's again kind of regardless around of the delivery mechanism, whether that's blockchain or whether it's directly delivered. How can you trust a particular proof? Who delivered it? What checks did they do? And blockchain is a great place to write that irrevocably and store a pointer back to it. It has the downside that if anything goes wrong with that proof, you've got to revoke it. And a lot of proofs really are quite dynamic. Even a passport, it expires, but it also gets stolen. So you can't rely on a passport being valid for any more than really the point where you verified it, because it could be stolen immediately after. And that's where you come into the whole fraud risk element around these identities, which blockchain helps mitigate, but also there's things that need to be built into the whole system to continually recheck the validity of particularly anything you're converting from a third-party proof, be that paper, be that electronic. Is it still valid, or has it changed since you created the proof or the verifiable credential that points to the proof?
Thanks, Nick. Very exhaustive.
So, questions. Several questions on regulation, and one says, what are the main regulatory issues when using SSI in the healthcare system? And then I've got others talking about several parts of the world, etc., etc. So, can you answer about the regulation issues?
I think one of the, if I can start on that one, I think one of the big issues that comes up every single time is there's a purist SSI view of trying to do as much as possible using zero knowledge proofs, which one part of it is regulation. Do the regulation require the doctor or the person processing you to have the full information in the first place? This is quite often the case in financial services. But there was an interesting discussion that was taking place on one of the working groups today to say, not only is it about the regulations that are in place, but about the second side of consent is the person who's receiving it. So say you go into a hotel and you tell them, hey, trust this, it says I'm a verified traveler, and they don't have anything to look at to say, yes, this is true, would they actually believe and consent to accepting that? So part of that is regulation to say, do you actually need to have access to the information? And most often right now, the regulations as they've been built need you to have the actual underlying information. So yes, SSI can still work there as long as the credentials or the presentations that you're providing to someone give the actual underlying information itself. The second part of it is the persons who are receiving it, will they be comfortable making a decision based on something zero knowledge? So if you go to a doctor and you say, hey, I have a zero knowledge proof that says I'm not allergic to peanuts, maybe they actually want to look at your entire medical history before they can make a judgment on that. Because at the end of the day, if they make a decision on it and it impacts you, they don't want to be liable for it. So that is something to bear in mind, especially working in healthcare use cases, from my perspective.
Yeah, but I think to answer that, Ankur, that's where just on the legal and the liability issues there, and that's where these trust schemes, as we describe them, come in that if I'm going to walk into a hotel, and let's say in a few months' time, it's with a self-sovereign identity with a zero knowledge proof that says that I'm COVID-19 clear. And if that's been written into regulation that it's acceptable, that's very easy for the hotel to say, yeah, okay, I trust that. The hotel's going to be able to read that in a way that confirms it's valid. So you've got to have a way to present that to the hotel in a way that they know that it's a trusted credential, and they know that if anyone, back to the fraud issue, if any bad actor has got into the system, they're not liable. And that's when we talk to relying parties, this is what they want to know is what happens if something goes wrong, and am I going to be liable, or is the identity provider going to take any liability for me trusting that information?
And I think to add to that, right, in certain parts of the world, the regulation states that certain industries have to basically actually keep either do a video KYC, or they have to basically keep a copy of the identity documents that the individual is providing, right? So in those cases, SSSI might not work, right? Because obviously now you're talking about doing a different mechanism to be compliant with the regulations of that particular country. So this is where I think there are certain industries which might not be, I think, SSI enabled in the near future. But then I think one of the good examples about we talked about renting a car, or I think checking in a hotel. I think a lot of cases is that are you just basically doing a zero knowledge proof, or are you also basically kind of sending a digital copy of your identity to them, right? To ensure that tomorrow if there's a problem, how do they deal with it? So this is where I think there are different industries regulated in different ways and across the world, and this is where I think the application of SSI might be limited in certain regions as opposed to others.
And finally, what I'd like to say is focus on the use cases and helping people right now. So especially if you're working on a use case for COVID-19, what the industry perhaps doesn't need is they might need solutions that work immediately with their current either ways of working or regulations, because sometimes it's not because of regulations, but just because of what they're used to, that we're dealing with right now. So I do see it as a journey that we go towards places where we can do KYC reliance, or relying on other parties, or perhaps if there's enough sort of credentials that you can prove something from, then yes, maybe we can move to some model of black box decisions, but I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, so it reflects on what the regulation says around KYC now in the EU. It says you should accept, for the purposes of KYC, an EI-notified ID. It doesn't say you have to know anything about how that ID was established, or what the ID proofs were behind it when it was put together. So that's a step in that direction. Now people, what people are going to say is, well, I want to record the proof that I had that ID from where, what scheme was it from, so that's their proof of evidence. but it's starting to recognise that the a trusted ID itself can be the evidence. And certainly as we work through the implementation of that in the UK into the JMLSG guidelines, we're trying to unpick that to say, well, you should be able to trust an ID without having to have all the evidence behind it, because that's literally what the law is saying.
Okay, I've got here like a question which would be good for a recap, because it's been many things. So the recap would be, what features shall have a secure blockchain identity? So can we do a recap? So what are the main pieces we should have now in order to start a project with a solid identity on blockchain? I know you can say it's all over the place, you have several things, but can we try to recap that way?
So your question is, where is the security of an identity on blockchain? But again, we have to specify what does it mean, identity on blockchain? Because here
the questions are around what are the main features you need to have in order to start talking seriously about self-sovereign identity on blockchain.
So I think that the key aspects are basically consent, privacy, ownership, and I think and then basically it's about the digital proof that we're talking about, right? How are you acquiring that digital proof, and then how are you storing that digital proof, and then how are you sharing that digital proof, right? So these are the key aspects around which you build a decentralized SSI, right? But these are, I think, the building blocks. That is what I would say.
I think it's also about the decentralized aspect, the fact that you can have several stakeholders, and you can have an identity that's interoperable. I think that's one of the key features. And it also, because of the nature of the decentralized aspect, you get portability for the individual. I think that's one of the appealing factors.
Verifiable credentials, zero knowledge proofs, and all of that to create safe identity systems or identity systems that we can trust. But it's a process, right? And we need to understand what is your threat model, because when people say things like, how can we make sure that it is safe, or how can we make sure that it won't be hacked? Well, define what hacked means, define what breach of privacy means, define the level of usability of it, right? Because I can build you the best system ever, but nobody will use it. There was a big part of my PhD research was around how to create systems that are unbreakable because they are very usable, not because they are, they have crazy crypto in it.
I've got two more questions, unless you want Nick to say something.
I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, and that underlines the need for the trust scheme and the legalities around the IDs. That it's the technology is improving and maturing all the time to be more secure. And the use of something like blockchain gives you an inherently secure way of storage and irrefutability. But building that layer of trust and understanding the liability on top of the technology is what's going to get adoption for these systems, not just the tech itself.
Okay, yeah, adoption is perfect transition, because I've got two questions about adoption. And the first one, and do customers actually want self-sovereign identity? And it's related to another one saying, okay, this self-sovereign identity is not new, so why don't we have something already on the blockchain?
Well, I'll pick up on that and give you my opinion. Divide customers into two groups. The end user, who will choose to have an identity with some supplier, and the reliant parties who are going to consume them. And the view of OAX is that they want a number of features around identity. They want it to be secure. They want it to be usable. They want critical mass of them. So if they're going to implement them, that they, that there's sufficient available to make it worth their while implementing them. They want some kind of liability cover, and they want to know what happens if it goes wrong, which the liability is part of.
But is there actually like a?
But they don't care whether it's a self-sovereign ID or not. Self-sovereign ID helps solve a number of the problems around security and trust, but they don't. The actual self-sovereign element is, most of them don't understand what it is, and probably should never need to.
I think to add to that, right? So I think anyways, I think with respect to this topic, there's a massive lack of awareness and education. This is where the end user doesn't even know what SSI means or what DID means. And actually, and it shouldn't matter actually, right? Because it's about the ease of use, it's about the convenience, and it's about the security, right? But then obviously, when we talk from the organization or the customer perspective, obviously it matters to them because it can basically massively reduce their overhead with respect to thefts and frauds. And this is where the fintech industry is quite open to SSI as a solution for certain challenges. And then also, I think across the world, certain governments are also exploring this idea, right? Because they see a value in this concept and in this idea as well as a solution, right? So there's acceptance from the industry and the government, but with respect to the end user, the question is whether we are making their lives simpler or we are making it more complex.
I'd love to hear Marta's answer on this. Like, now that you've just said you did your whole PhD on that, that would be quite interesting to hear from you on making usable solutions because they secure solutions because they're usable, not because of crazy crypto. And I think that's where SSI is.
Well, I mean, there are some interesting projects. There are two projects that I came across that make me very hopeful. One of them, if I can't find, let me just find the names of it. One is iRespond, and the other one is TiiQu technology. So one of them is about basically both of them are kind of identity systems. One of them is creating a private, portable, secure identity for refugee camps, and they have an ongoing project in Turkey. They also have a project somewhere in Africa as well. So there is quite a few of those. And then the other one is the iRespond one, which is fighting human trafficking in Thai fishing industry and increasing privacy of sensitive testing. That's actually something that ties back to the COVID thing. They created an app that they tested in Kenya to kind of protect privacy of patients that were tested for HIV. And they showed that 99.86% of the patients tested, and it was almost 9,000 people, agreed to register using iRespond. So these are serious numbers and serious projects. And I think that we are very early in the blockchain world in general with usability. Most of these things have a long way to go, but I think seen last year more and more discussions about it, and definitely this year, as we are moving to production, we are realizing the quick and dirty is not good for people to actually use it normally or day to day. And now it's, I'm reading more and more posts and articles about the creating user interface and user experience in blockchain and good practices for UI design in blockchain, which is very different to what I've seen.
Interesting.
Thank you, guys. I think we have to close it here. Can I ask just a last sentence from each speaker, please, to close this conversation and leave some thoughts for brain to our audience? Ankur, do you want to start?
Sure. My one sentence is, I think we're pretty much all thinking the same ideas. In terms of like what everyone's looking at doing within the industry, make it usable and make it secure in such a way that someone who's not very technologically cares about, like, in this particular space is able to use it.
Thank you. Shiv. Your last thought. Well, not forever, just for today.
Good one. Yeah. So I think because this is a new industry and kind of a new concept in terms of using blockchain for SSI. I think the industry should be looking at collaboration and not I think a competition. It should be about basically how we can build solutions which are actually solving the real life challenges like COVID or maybe human trafficking, and then there's so many other social causes as well as basically citizen-focused services, right? So this is where I think we have to be more responsible about how do you approach this problem.
Thank you very much. Keerthi, please.
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the difficulties of this technology being adopted is the stakeholder buy-in. I think that's very true of all blockchain systems. It's very difficult to build decentralized applications, especially if multiple stakeholders have varying goals. But what I'm actually seeing is that there are pockets of ecosystems that can actually facilitate the use of blockchain and SSI, and we will find more applications being used or developed in those pockets. It may not happen at the grand scale that we want, but it may happen in those very limited spaces that there's tremendous potential.
Thanks. Marta, do you want to say your word?
One word? I'm going to say a sentence. I'll try one sentence.
Please.
I think that the next step for us is to start educating ourselves on what others are doing. I am afraid that in today's world, we are so focused on our project and being really good at our project that every day, even today, I've learned about 5 different initiatives I had no clue about. And I thought I was pretty up to date with what is happening in identity space. So I think that in order to start collaborating, we do need to start talking to each other.
TiiQu, your sentence, please.
Final thoughts. I think, if anything, the time is now for what we're looking at. The current crisis underlines the need for ID to know all manner of citizens, be that health employees, those seeking healthcare, citizens who need to be cleared of coronavirus, people who need to travel in future. So this crisis is underlining the need for what we provide. So I think it's up to us as a community to, as I say, collaborate and crystallize those needs over the coming months to solve problems now, but also solve the digital ID problem across the globe once and for all. Imagine if we'd solved this a few years ago, how much easier some of the challenges we're now seeing today would be to deal with. So I think it underlines the opportunity for identity in all different flavors. It's now is the time.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you to all of you. Mike, please come back to the next one. And thank you very much to Philippe and Louis, who made the event possible with me. Thank you again, and bye-bye to the next one. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.